At 41 years old, Everett Wallace, a man whose deep brown skin seemed to absorb and soften the harsh fluorescent light of any room, earned a respectable $68,000 a year as a logistics manager. He drove a 2014 Honda Accord with 112,000 miles on it, lived in a tidy one-bedroom apartment in Houston's 3rd Ward that cost him $1,250 a month in rent, and believed in the quiet dignity of a day's work. He was a simple man, or so the world believed. And on this Tuesday at 2:15 p.m., in a glass-walled conference room on the 47th floor of a skyscraper in downtown Houston, that simplicity was being used as a weapon against him. The room was cold, the air conditioned to a brisk 65 degrees. It smelled of expensive leather and old paper. Across the vast mahogany table, which probably cost more than his car, a solid $30,000 slab of polished wood, sat his fiancée, Camille Vance. Beside her were her parents, Arthur and Eleanor. Arthur, with his silver hair and a $4,000 canali suit, looked severe and impatient. Eleanor, draped in a cream-colored Chanel jacket that cost at least $9,000, radiated a frosty disappointment. Their family lawyer, a man named Mr. Henderson, with a face like a clenched fist, slid a thick document across the table. The embossed leather folder it was in whispered of money Everett had supposedly never touched. "It's just a formality, Everett," Camille said, her voice a little too bright. She was wearing a silk blouse worth $800, a casual choice for an afternoon of financial humiliation. "Daddy insists," Arthur grunted, a sound of pure dismissal. "It's not a formality. It's a necessity. We have to protect Camille's assets. You understand? You're bringing nothing to the table." The words hung in the sterile air. Nothing. Everett looked at his hands, resting on the table. They were strong, capable hands that had unloaded trucks in his youth and now orchestrated the complex ballet of global shipping. They were the hands that had fixed Camille's leaky faucet and held her when she cried over some petty social slight. They were, in Arthur Vance's estimation, worth nothing. Everett earned $68,000 a year. Camille's trust fund, which she would fully inherit on their wedding day, was valued at a little over $2 million. The math, in their eyes, was simple and brutal. Eleanor added, her voice dripping with condescension, "We just can't have you thinking you're entitled to the Vance family legacy, dear. It wouldn't be right." Everett felt a familiar, cold knot tightening in his stomach. He had known this was coming. For 6 months, every conversation had been laced with subtle and not so subtle reminders of his financial station. But this felt different. This was a ceremony of degradation. He was being asked to sign a document that legally codified his own worthlessness in their eyes. He picked up the document. The paper was heavy, a high-grade linen stock. The ink was a deep, uncompromising black. He started to read, his background in logistics making him preternaturally attentive to fine print and contractual language. "There's no need to read the whole thing," Henderson the lawyer said with a dismissive wave of his $1,200 Mont Blanc pen. "It's a standard prenuptial agreement. It stipulates that in the event of a divorce, all premarital assets remain separate property. You waive any and all claim to Miss Vance's trust, inheritance, and any appreciation of those assets during the marriage." He smiled, a tight, unpleasant curl of the lips. "Essentially, you leave with what you came with, which is, to be blunt, nothing." Arthur chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Sign it, Everett. Let's get this over with." Everett's eyes scanned the pages. The language was dense, suffocating. It felt like being buried alive in legalese. He saw the clauses about the River Oaks estate, the portfolio of stocks, the art collection. Everything was itemized, protected, walled off from him. It was a fortress of paper and ink. He was an outsider, being handed the visitor's rules. What would you do in this situation? How do you sit in a room with the woman you love and her family as they laugh at your life's work? We've all felt underestimated before, but this was a masterclass in humiliation. If you've ever been made to feel small, let me know in the comments. I think you'll appreciate where this is going. Everett continued to read, his silence stretching the tension in the room. He felt their impatience, their annoyance. Why was the poor man wasting their time reading a document whose conclusion was already foregone? He was supposed to be grateful, to sign with a humble flourish and accept his station. But Everett was a logistics man. He knew that the most important detail is often the one everyone else overlooks. And then, on page 14, in a subclause of a subclause, he found it. Their story hadn't started with lawyers and financial disclosures. It had started, ironically, at a charity gala. Everett wasn't there as a donor. His company had sponsored a table for $5,000, and as a senior manager, he was required to attend. He felt out of place in his one good suit, a simple black $450 Hugo Boss number he'd bought for a cousin's wedding. He stood near the bar, nursing a glass of club soda, watching a world he didn't belong to. The women were in glittering gowns that cost more than his monthly salary, their jewelry flashing under the ballroom lights. The men wore watches that could have paid off his student loans. Then he saw Camille. She was arguing with a waiter about the temperature of the champagne, but she did it with a kind of fiery charm that made Everett smile. She was beautiful, with luminous skin and her hair styled in elegant, intricate braids that fell over one shoulder. When she turned and caught him watching, her annoyance melted into a dazzling smile. They talked for hours, standing in a quiet corner away from the thrum of the auction. She was funny, sharp, and seemed genuinely interested in his life. She didn't scoff when he told her he was a logistics manager. She asked intelligent questions about supply chains and freight forwarding. For the first time, Everett felt seen by someone from that world. Their first few months were a whirlwind. They existed in a bubble, meeting for dinner at cozy, inexpensive restaurants in Montrose that Everett knew, or walking through Herman Park under the warm Texas sun. He fell in love with her quick laugh and the way she'd lean her head on his shoulder when they watched old movies in his small Third Ward apartment. The apartment was filled with books and the scent of the coffee he ground himself every morning. On the walls were framed photographs of his parents, two proud, smiling black people who had built a small but successful trucking company from nothing. The first crack in the facade appeared about 4 months in when he met her parents. He drove his 2014 Honda Accord to their estate in River Oaks. Pulling up the long, crushed stone driveway felt like driving onto a movie set. The house wasn't a house. It was a monument of glass and white stone, a $12 million architectural marvel that looked more like a modern art museum than a home. Arthur and Eleanor Vance greeted him in a cavernous living room with 20-foot ceilings and a wall of glass overlooking a pristine, manicured garden. "Everett," Arthur said, his handshake limp and brief. "Camille tells us you're in transportation." He said the word transportation, as if it were something one might scrape off the bottom of a shoe. "Logistics, sir," Everett corrected gently. "I manage international freight for a large firm." "Fascinating," Eleanor said, though her eyes were busy cataloging his off-the-rack $89 department store blazer and his sensible $120 Cole Haan shoes. "And what does a logistics manager make these days?" The question was so blunt, so nakedly transactional, that Everett was momentarily stunned. Camille jumped in, flustered. "Mother, you can't ask that." "Why not?" Arthur countered, settling into a severe-looking leather armchair that probably cost $15,000. "I'm just trying to get to know the young man. We have to understand his prospects." Everett, deciding that evasion was pointless, answered calmly. My salary is $68,000 a year, sir. A thick, heavy silence descended on the room. It was broken only by the faint hum of the industrial-grade air conditioning. Arthur and Eleanor exchanged a look. It was a fleeting glance, but it contained a whole universe of judgment. In that single moment, Everett Wallace was weighed, measured, and found wanting. The number, $68,000, hung in the air between them, an insult to the polished marble floors, and the abstract painting on the wall that Everett would later learn was a Gerhard Richter worth over $3 million. He looked at Camille, hoping for an ally. But she was looking at the floor, her cheeks flushed with what he realized with a sinking heart was not anger, but embarrassment. That evening was the beginning of the slow, grinding erosion of his dignity. The escalating betrayals became a regular feature of their relationship. They were rarely explosive. Instead, they were a series of 1,000 tiny cuts, each one delivered with a smile. At family dinners, Arthur would make a point of discussing his latest stock market windfall, a casual $500,000 gain on a tech IPO, before turning to Everett and asking, "How's the trucking business, son?" "It's logistics, Arthur," Everett would say, his voice even. "And it's going well, thank you." "Good, good," Arthur would reply, patting him on the shoulder in a gesture that was meant to look paternal, but felt deeply condescending. A man needs a hobby. Camille, caught between the man she loved and the family whose approval she craved, became an unwilling accomplice. When her parents belittled Everett's job, she would offer a weak defense. "Daddy, stop it. Everett works very hard." But then she would turn to Everett later and say, "You can't blame them, babe. They just don't understand your world. Maybe you could think about getting an MBA? Or going into finance? My cousin Stephen makes $400,000 a year as a junior analyst." The suggestions were always framed as loving concern for his future, for their future. But the subtext was clear. You are not enough. Your life, your career, your $68,000, it's not enough. He started to feel like a project, a fixer-upper she had taken on. She loved his character, his stability, his kindness. But she was deeply ashamed of his balance sheet. The engagement was a perfect example of this duality. He proposed in Herman Park at sunset with a simple, elegant sapphire ring he had spent 3 months saving for. It cost $4,200, nearly a month's take-home pay. It was the most expensive thing he had ever bought. Camille cried and said yes. She loved the ring. She truly did. For a week, she showed it off to everyone. Then, they had dinner with her parents. Eleanor squinted at the ring under the light of their dining room chandelier, a $50,000 fixture of cascading crystal. "Oh, it's sweet, dear," she said, her voice thin, very understated. The next day, Camille came to his apartment. She was wearing a new ring, a massive, blinding diamond, at least 4 carats, set in platinum. It had replaced the sapphire. "Daddy thought the other one was a bit delicate for everyday wear," she explained, avoiding his eyes. "This is the family engagement ring. It's just for show, you know. I'll still wear your, sometimes." The sapphire ring, his $4,200 declaration of love, was relegated to a jewelry box. The new ring, a $150,000 monster, became the public symbol of their engagement. When friends complimented it, Camille would say, "Oh, it's a family heirloom." A convenient fiction that erased Everett's contribution entirely. The cruelty became more overt as the wedding planning began. The Vances were planning a lavish affair at the Houstonian Hotel, a $200,000 spectacle for 300 of their closest friends and business associates. Everett was never consulted on the budget, the venue, or the guest list. He was simply informed. When he tried to offer an opinion, Arthur would cut him off. "Everett, what do you know about planning an event of this scale? Let us handle it. Your only job is to show up. One Saturday afternoon, Camille took him to be fitted for his wedding suit. He assumed they were going to a decent menswear store, perhaps the same one where he'd bought his Hugo Boss suit. Instead, she pulled her white BMW 3 Series, a $43,000 car, into the parking lot of a generic low-end suit warehouse. "My parents' wedding gift to you," she announced cheerfully. Inside, a bored salesman measured him. The suits were racks upon racks of polyester blends and ill-fitting jackets. Arthur and Eleanor were there, observing the process from a distance. Eleanor picked out a shiny silver gray suit. It felt cheap to the touch. The tag said $299.99. "This one will do," Eleanor declared. "It looks festive." Everett stood in front of the mirror. The suit hung off his shoulders. The fabric was stiff and uncomfortable. He looked like a man playing dress-up in someone else's bad taste. Meanwhile, Camille had been talking for weeks about her custom-made wedding gown, a $22,000 creation by a famous designer. The contrast was staggering, a deliberate and calculated insult. "What do you think?" Camille asked, her eyes shining. She genuinely seemed to think this was a wonderful gesture. Everett looked at his reflection, then at the Vances, who were watching him with expressions of faint amusement. He felt a cold, hard anger crystallize in his chest. It was an anger he hadn't felt in years, a deep, primal fury. But his face remained a calm, unreadable mask. "It's very generous," he said, his voice quiet. "Thank you." This was the man who walked into the lawyer's office to sign the prenup. A man who had been slowly, systematically stripped of his pride. They thought he was a simple man, a poor man, a man they could push around and patronize. They saw his calm demeanor as weakness. They saw his modesty as a lack of ambition. They had no idea how wrong they were. They had no idea what was coming. There on page 14, nestled in Article 5, Section 3, subsection C, was the sentence that changed everything. The document was meticulously crafted to protect every penny of the Vance family's $2 million fortune from him. But their lawyer, in his arrogance and haste to build an ironclad wall around Camille's assets, had included a standard reciprocal clause. It read, "Furthermore, any and all assets, trusts, holdings, or properties held by either party prior to the date of marriage, which are not explicitly disclosed in Schedule A or Schedule B of this agreement, shall remain the sole and separate property of the originating party, impervious to any and all claims by the other party in the event of marital dissolution." Henderson had only filled out Schedule A, Camille's assets. It was a long and detailed list, from her stock portfolio down to her grandmother's silver. Schedule B, Everett Wallace's assets, was comically, insultingly blank. A single line had been typed in the middle of the empty page. Personal checking account, approximate value, $3,500. They hadn't even bothered to ask him. They had just assumed. They assumed his $68,000 salary, his Honda Accord, and his rented apartment were the sum total of his existence. They had built a fortress to keep him out. But their lawyer had, in his hubris, built that fortress with a secret door. And he had just handed Everett the key. A slow, cold calm washed over Everett. The knot in his stomach dissolved. The anger in his chest cooled into something hard and sharp, like steel. He looked up from the document. Arthur was checking his $25,000 Patek Philippe watch. Eleanor was examining her manicure. Camille was scrolling through her phone, probably looking at wedding photographers. Everett picked up the $1,200 Mont Blanc pen. It felt heavy and powerful in his hand. He clicked it. The sound was sharp and definitive in the quiet room. All eyes snapped to him. "Is there a problem, Everett?" Arthur asked, his voice laced with irritation. Everett met his gaze. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to be polite or deferential. He felt a profound and liberating sense of nothing. "No, Arthur," he said, his voice steady and clear. "No problem at all." He signed his name on the signature line. The stroke of the pen was smooth, the ink a dark, final black. He slid the document back across the polished mahogany. "It seems perfectly fair," he said. Henderson, the lawyer, gave a satisfied smirk. Eleanor let out a small sigh of relief. Arthur grunted, a sound of victory. "Good," he said. "Now that that's settled." Camille beamed at him, a radiant smile of pure relief. She came around the table and kissed him on the cheek. "Thank you, baby," she whispered, her relief palpable. "I knew you'd understand." He smiled back at her, a gentle, sad smile. "Of course," he said. "I understand completely." What none of them knew, what they couldn't possibly fathom, was the nature of the secret he held. They saw a logistics manager. They didn't see the son of James and Sarah Wallace, the quiet, brilliant founders of Wallace Freight, a non-asset-based logistics company they started in the 1980s. They had been pioneers, building a sophisticated brokerage that connected shippers with carriers long before it was fashionable, using technology and relentless efficiency. They lived simply in the same Third Ward neighborhood where Everett still lived, pouring every spare dollar back into the business. They sold the company in 2008 to a massive international conglomerate for a staggering sum. And when they passed away within a year of each other, they left their only son, Everett, with a quietly managed, legally untouchable trust fund. It was structured by the sharpest estate lawyers in Texas, designed to be invisible and inaccessible to anyone but him and his designated trustee. The current value of that trust, which sat in a portfolio of conservative investments and real estate holdings, was just a little over $200 million. He had made a critical mistake in underestimating them, but they had made a fatal one in underestimating him. The weeks between the prenup signing and the wedding were a masterclass in emotional restraint. Everett Wallace, the man they believed they had successfully neutered, became the perfect, compliant fiancé. He was playing dumb, and he was playing for keeps. Every smile was a lie, every nod of agreement a strategic maneuver. He was a spy in his own life, gathering intelligence while the enemy celebrated their victory. The wedding itself was the grand stage for his performance. He stood at the altar of a massive, ornate church in River Oaks, wearing the shiny, ill-fitting $300 suit they had bought him. He watched Camille walk down the aisle. She was a vision in her $22,000 gown, a cloud of white lace and silk. Her family and their 300 wealthy friends filled the pews, their diamonds and pearls glittering in the light from the stained glass windows. As he looked out at the sea of smug, privileged faces, he felt a strange detachment. He was an actor in a play, and he knew how it was going to end. During the reception at the Houstonian, Arthur clapped him on the back, a little too hard. "Welcome to the family, son," he boomed, his breath smelling of expensive scotch. "Just remember the pecking order." He laughed, and the men around him, all CEOs and investment bankers, laughed with him. Everett just smiled. "I'll keep that in mind, Arthur." Later, Eleanor cornered him by the towering 10-tier wedding cake, a $7,000 confection of sugar and vanity. "Camille is a very special girl, Everett," she said, her voice low and conspiratorial. "She has certain needs, a certain lifestyle. I trust you won't stand in the way of that. Her allowance from the trust is quite generous, and it's for her to enjoy, not for paying off a mortgage on some little house in the suburbs." "I would never dream of it, Eleanor," he said, his voice a perfect blend of sincerity and submission. "Camille's happiness is all that matters." He made a mental note of her words, her allowance, for her to enjoy, not for a mortgage. It was another piece of evidence. The honeymoon was a 2-week trip to Italy, paid for entirely by the Vance Family Trust. It was a $40,000 exercise in opulent travel. They stayed in presidential suites in 5-star hotels overlooking the Amalfi Coast. They ate at Michelin-starred restaurants where the tasting menu cost $500 a person. Everett, in his simple clothes, was treated by the hotel staff with a faint, polite disdain until they saw him with Camille. He was the consort, the accessory. One evening they were having dinner on a terrace overlooking the sea. The sunset was painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. It should have been romantic. "Isn't this amazing?" Camille sighed, swirling a glass of $300 Barolo. "I could get used to this." She looked at him, a thoughtful expression on her face. "You know, Everett, now that we're married, we should really think about your career. That logistics thing is fine, but it's not a long-term plan. Daddy can get you a job at his friend's investment bank. You'd start at the bottom, of course, probably making what you make now. But the potential, in 5 years, you could be clearing $250,000. "I like my job, Camille," he said quietly. "But it's not just about what you like, is it?" she replied, her tone shifting from dreamy to practical. "It's about our life, our future children. They can't go to public school. We need to be able to afford St. John's. And that's $35,000 a year per child. Your salary wouldn't even cover one of them." He didn't argue. He just nodded, letting her believe she was convincing him. He filed away the conversation. Your salary wouldn't even cover one of them. It was perfect. Each condescending remark, each casual dismissal of his life's work, was a nail she was hammering into her own coffin. He was building a case, not out of anger anymore, but with the cold, dispassionate precision of the logistics manager he was. He was documenting every slight, every insult, every confirmation that this marriage was not a partnership, but a transaction in which he was deemed to have no value. He was living a lie, and the strain was immense, but he knew the truth would be worth the wait. The day after they returned from Italy, at 9 a.m. sharp, Everett walked into a discreet wood-paneled office in a quiet building on Post Oak Boulevard. There was no grand sign on the door, just a small brass plate that read, "Franklin & Shaw, Private Wealth Management." Inside, he was greeted by Mr. Robert Franklin, a man in his late 60s with kind eyes, a razor-sharp mind, and hair the color of snow. Robert had been his father's best friend and the sole trustee of the Wallace Family Trust since its inception. He had known Everett since he was a boy. He was wearing a simple, well-tailored gray suit that probably cost $5,000. But it was worn with an understated ease that made it look like a comfortable sweater. "Everett," Robert said, rising from behind his large, uncluttered desk. "Good to see you. How was Italy?" "Expensive," Everett replied with a wry smile, sinking into a soft leather chair. "I imagine so," Robert said, his eyes twinkling. He gestured to a file on his desk. "I have the document you sent over, their prenuptial agreement. It is, and I say this with 40 years of legal experience, one of the most arrogantly drafted and beautifully self-destructive things I have ever read." Everett felt a wave of relief. "So it's as good as I thought?" "Better," Robert confirmed. Their lawyer was so focused on protecting her $2 million from a man they assumed had $2,000 that he used a boilerplate reciprocity clause without a moment's thought. They legally and contractually agreed that any undisclosed premarital assets are off the table. By failing to ask you for a disclosure, they waived their right to ever claim a stake in it. It's poetic, really. You are protected by their own greed. For the next hour, they planned. Robert laid out the strategy with methodical precision. It wouldn't be a messy, emotional confrontation. It would be a quiet, legal execution. First, you continue as you are, Robert instructed. Let them get comfortable. Let them establish a pattern of behavior. We need to demonstrate that their opinion of your financial status was not just a one-time mistake, but a core belief of the relationship. Every comment about your job, every suggestion you get a real career, is valuable. Robert's firm, billing at a rate of $1,500 per hour, began compiling the necessary paperwork. They prepared the divorce filing, citing irreconcilable differences. But the core of their case was the prenup. They would not be challenging it. They would be enforcing it. Vigorously. We will file in exactly 90 days, Robert decided. It's long enough to establish the marriage as legitimate, but not so long that they can argue a commingling of lifestyles has occurred. During this time, you will not accept any significant financial gifts from them. You will continue to pay for your own expenses from your salary. You live as Everett Wallace, the $68,000 a year logistics manager. Do not give them any reason to suspect otherwise. Everett handed Robert a small, encrypted USB drive. I've been keeping a journal, he explained. Dates, times, exact quotes. The conversation about my salary not covering school tuition. Eleanor's comment about her allowance being for her to enjoy. Arthur telling me to remember the pecking order. It's all there. Robert took the drive and nodded, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. Excellent. This is the narrative. This proves their mindset. They never saw you as a partner. They saw you as a dependent. The court will see that. When we reveal the full scope of your assets, their argument that they were somehow misled or that the prenup is unconscionable will evaporate. They can't claim it's unfair to them when the entire document was designed to be profoundly unfair to you. Everett leaned forward. What about my own plans, Robert? The logistics company I want to build. For years, Everett had been quietly drafting a business plan, a next-generation logistics firm that would use predictive analytics and AI to revolutionize the industry, a true successor to what his parents had started. That, Robert said with a smile, is what we are fighting for. Your freedom. The trust was set up to give you the capital to pursue your dreams, not to subsidize someone else's lifestyle. We'll get your freedom, Everett, and we'll use their own pen to sign the order. Leaving Robert's office, Everett felt the Houston sun on his face. For the first time in months, it felt warm. He had a plan. He had an ally. The next 90 days would be the hardest of his life, a silent endurance test. But he knew with absolute certainty that on the other side of it lay the rest of his life, a life lived on his own terms. The strike was planned with the precision of a military operation. The date was set for a Friday, 93 days after the wedding. Robert had learned through a discreet inquiry that the Vance family would be hosting their annual late summer brunch for their most important social and business contacts at the River Oaks mansion. The timing was perfect. Maximum impact. At 11:30 a.m. on that Friday, Everett was at his desk at work, coordinating a shipment of medical supplies to West Africa. He was calm, focused, his mind on the complexities of customs clearance and air freight schedules. He had already moved his personal belongings out of the guest room he'd been using at the mansion and back into his third ward apartment, under the guise of needing to be closer to the office for a big project. Camille had barely noticed. At exactly 12:15 p.m., a professional process server, a tall, impassive man in a nondescript suit, walked up the long, crushed stone driveway of the Vance estate. The party was in full swing. Waiters in white jackets moved through the crowd with trays of champagne and canapes. A string quartet played softly near the pool. The air was filled with the sound of laughter and polite, wealthy conversation. The server approached a waiter and asked for Camille Wallace. He was pointed towards the grand patio, where Camille was holding court with a group of her friends, laughing about some story. She looked radiant in a yellow sundress that cost $1,500. Camille Wallace? the server asked, his voice polite but firm. Yes, she said, turning, her smile faltering slightly at the sight of this serious-looking stranger. You've been served, he said, handing her a thick manila envelope. He then turned and walked away without another word, melting back into the background. Camille stared at the envelope, confused. Her friends fell silent. Arthur, noticing the disturbance from across the patio, began to walk over, a frown on his face. "What is it, darling?" he asked. Camille tore open the envelope. Her eyes scanned the first page. It was a formal legal document from the District Court of Harris County. She saw the words, "Petition for Divorce." And then she saw the names: Petitioner, Everett J. Wallace. Respondent, Camille A. Vance Wallace. The color drained from her face. The champagne glass she was holding slipped from her fingers and shattered on the marble patio. The sound unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. The string quartet faltered, then stopped playing altogether. Everyone was staring. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What is this joke?" Arthur snatched the papers from her hand. His face, already stern, hardened into a mask of fury as he read. "He's divorcing you?" he spat, his voice a low growl of disbelief. "That ungrateful? After everything we've done for him?" The scene that followed was a cascade of quiet chaos. The guests began to murmur, their polite conversations turning into urgent whispers. The social event of the season had just become a public spectacle of the most delicious kind. Eleanor rushed to her daughter's side, her face a mixture of horror and outrage. Everett's phone, sitting silently on his desk, lit up. 12:19 p.m. A call from Camille? He ignored it. It lit up again. 12:20 p.m. A call from Arthur. He ignored it. Then the texts began. The first was from Camille. 12:21 p.m. Everett, what is the meaning of this? Call me right now. This isn't funny. He read it, then calmly went back to reviewing a bill of lading. A new text. 12:25 p.m. I can't believe you would do this. Humiliate me in front of everyone? Who do you think you are? Another. 12:30 p.m. My father is going to destroy you. You have no idea what you've just done. You will leave this marriage with nothing. You hear me? The prenup you signed guarantees it, you idiot. Everett felt a grim satisfaction. The prenup you signed guarantees it. She had just confirmed the core of his entire strategy. He took a screenshot. An hour passed. The frantic messages turned into frantic voicemails. He listened to them later that evening, in the quiet of his own apartment. The first was from Camille, her voice high and angry. Everett, this is Camille. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but it's over. You have embarrassed me and my family for the last time. Our lawyer will be in touch. You are going to regret this for the rest of your miserable $60,000 life. The next was from Arthur, dripping with menace. Wallace, you just made the biggest mistake of your life. I will personally see to it that you never work in this town again. I will bury you. You signed the papers. You get nothing. You are nothing. Everett saved the voicemails. They were evidence. They were the sound of an empire beginning to crumble, not with a bang, but with the sputtering rage of entitled people who had just lost control. He sat back in his favorite armchair, the one his father used to sit in, and took a deep breath. The air in his apartment, filled with the familiar smell of old books and his own life, had never smelled so sweet. The war had begun, and they didn't even know they had already lost. The consequences cascaded with brutal legal efficiency. The Vances, accustomed to solving problems with threats and money, ran headfirst into a wall of quiet, unshakable competence. Their first move was to hire the most expensive and aggressive divorce attorney in Houston, a man named Donovan Pike, who billed at $2,000 an hour and was known for tearing apart opponents in court. The first meeting was a deposition, held in a neutral conference room. Camille, Arthur, and Eleanor sat on one side of the table with Pike. Everett sat on the other side with Robert Franklin. The air was thick with hostility. Pike began, his voice smooth and confident. "Mr. Wallace, we are here today because of this frivolous and frankly insulting petition for divorce. My client, Miss Vance, is prepared to be generous. She will not contest the divorce, but per the prenuptial agreement signed on August 12th, you will, of course, be vacating the marriage with no claim to her assets. The agreement is ironclad." Robert Franklin smiled faintly. "We agree, Mr. Pike. The agreement is indeed ironclad, and my client, Mr. Wallace, intends to enforce it to the letter." Pike looked confused. "Enforce it? There's nothing for him to enforce. He has no assets to protect." "That," Robert said, his voice dropping into a quiet, serious tone, "is where you are mistaken." He slid a file across the table. It was not a thick file. It was a single slender folder. "This is the complete and audited statement of the Wallace Family Trust, of which my client, Mr. Everett Wallace, is the sole beneficiary. As you know, the prenuptial agreement that your clients drafted contains a reciprocity clause regarding undisclosed premarital assets. Since your clients failed to request a financial disclosure from Mr. Wallace, his pre-existing assets remain his sole and separate property." Pike opened the folder. His smug expression slowly dissolved, replaced by a slack-jawed disbelief. Camille and her parents leaned forward, trying to see. "As of the date of the marriage," Robert continued calmly, "the value of the trust was $197,452,000. Its current valuation is just over $203 million. Silence. A profound, deafening silence filled the room. Arthur Vance's face went from ruddy to a pasty, sickly white. Eleanor looked as if she might faint. Camille just stared, her mouth slightly open, her eyes wide with a horror that was almost comical. $200 million. The number was so vast, so far beyond their comprehension of Everett, that it didn't seem real. This is a joke," Camille stammered, looking from the paper to Everett's calm face. "This is fake. You work in logistics. You drive a Honda." "I do," Everett said, speaking for the first time. "I enjoy my job, and it's a very reliable car." Pike, the high-priced lawyer, finally found his voice, though it was weak. This is fraudulent. He misrepresented himself." Robert Franklin leaned back in his chair. "Misrepresented? My client was never asked about his finances. In fact, your clients repeatedly and explicitly stated that his finances were irrelevant. They told him he brought nothing to the table. They presented him with a list of their assets and told him to sign. He complied. We have records. A journal kept by my client. Voicemails from your client and her father confirming their view of his financial status. They built the box. Mr. Pike, my client is simply asking that they be forced to live inside it." The fight went out of them. Pike knew he was beaten. The document was their own creation. The arrogance that had led them to not even bother asking Everett for a financial statement was the very thing that now disarmed them completely. Camille's claim to any part of Everett's $200 million fortune was blocked, not by his lawyers, but by hers. The downfall was swift. First, the legal consequence. The divorce was finalized in less than a month. The judge took one look at the prenup, the evidence of the Vance's condescension, and the statement from the Wallace Trust. He enforced the agreement exactly as written. Camille received nothing from Everett. Everett received nothing from Camille. He walked away with his $200 million intact. She walked away with her $2 million trust, which suddenly seemed like pocket change. Second, the financial consequence. Arthur Vance, in his initial rage, had made threats against Everett. Robert Franklin sent a polite but firm letter to Arthur's lawyer, reminding him that any attempt to interfere with Everett's career or business interests would be met with a lawsuit for tortious interference, funded by a legal war chest that could sustain litigation for decades. Arthur, facing the prospect of battling a $200 million trust, was forced into a humiliating retreat. Third, the social consequence. The story leaked. The tale of the poor logistics manager who was secretly one of the wealthiest men in Houston became the talk of River Oaks. The Vances became a laughingstock. They were seen not as savvy protectors of their fortune, but as arrogant fools who had been outplayed. The public humiliation Camille had tried to inflict on Everett at the prenup signing was returned to her 100-fold. Friends stopped calling. Party invitations dried up. Their social standing, built on a foundation of perceived financial superiority, crumbled overnight. They were just another family with a couple of $1 million, and in their world, that was nothing. The final voicemail Everett ever received from Camille came a week after the divorce was final. It was late at night. Her voice was no longer angry, just hollow and defeated. "Everett, I don't understand. Why? Why didn't you just tell me? We could have... I loved you." He listened to it once, then deleted it. She didn't love him. She had loved the idea of him, but she was ashamed of the reality. And she would never understand that true wealth had nothing to do with the number in your bank account. It was about character, and hers had been found wanting. 2 years passed. The Houston skyline, with its glass towers that once seemed to represent an emotional distance he could never cross, now looked like a landscape of opportunity. The rain that had once felt like a symbol of his vulnerability had given way to long stretches of brilliant, healing sunlight. Everett Wallace was no longer just a logistics manager. He was the founder and CEO of Wallace Predictive Logistics, a rapidly growing firm headquartered in a sleek, modern office space in the energy corridor. He had used an initial $30 million from his trust to build the company he had always dreamed of. He hired the best minds in data science and supply chain management, creating a platform that was revolutionizing how goods moved around the world. The company was already valued at over $150 million and was on track to become a billion-dollar enterprise. He still drove a Honda, a brand-new Accord hybrid this time, a modest $38,000 vehicle, and he still lived in the Third Ward, though he had bought and beautifully renovated a historic brick townhouse. His life was no longer defined by other people's expectations. It was his. He found joy in the simple things. The quiet satisfaction of solving a complex problem, the camaraderie of the team he had built, the peace of a Saturday morning spent in his own sun-drenched garden. The garden was his sanctuary, a place of growth and renewal, a stark contrast to the sterile, manicured perfection of the Vance estate. One afternoon he was sitting at his desk when his assistant told him he had a visitor. He wasn't expecting anyone. He walked out to the reception area and saw her, Camille. She looked different. The expensive clothes were gone, replaced by a simple dress. The arrogant confidence was gone, replaced by a weary uncertainty. The 2 years had not been kind to her. Her family's social fall had been complete, and he'd heard through the grapevine that her trust fund had taken a significant hit from some bad investments her father had made in a desperate attempt to regain their status. "Everett," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Camille?" he replied, his voice even, not cold but not warm either. It was simply neutral. "Your company, it's incredible," she said, gesturing around the busy, vibrant office. "I read about it in the Chronicle. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." He listened. He saw the regret in her eyes, and for the first time he felt a flicker of something other than the cold steel of resolve. It wasn't love. It was a distant, quiet pity. "I was a fool," she continued, tears welling in her eyes. "I was raised to believe that a person's worth was their net worth. I was so worried about what everyone would think. I threw away the only good thing that ever happened to me." Everett thought for a moment, his mind going back to that cold conference room, the feel of the pen in his hand, the smug looks on their faces. He had carried that anger for a long time. But looking at the diminished woman in front of him, he realized the anger was gone. It had served its purpose. It had fueled his escape. Now it was just dead weight. Forgiving her wasn't for her benefit. It was for his. It was the final piece of logistics, the last item to be cleared, so his own shipment could move forward. "I accept your apology, Camille," he said, and he meant it. "I wish you well." It was a dismissal, and she knew it. It was kind, but it was final. She nodded, wiped a tear from her cheek, and walked away. He watched her go, a ghost from a life that no longer belonged to him. He learned a valuable lesson from the Vances. True wealth isn't about the money you have. It's about the person you are when you have none. It's about character, integrity, and the quiet dignity of knowing your own value, even when the world tells you that you are worth nothing. They had tried to write his story for him, to cast him as a minor character in their grand drama. But in the end, every one of us is the author of our own life. We hold the pen. We get to decide how the story ends. What do you think is the true measure of a person's worth? Is it their bank account, their job title, or something deeper? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe in the power of quiet strength and earned success, make sure to like and subscribe to Love Beyond Pride for more stories like Everett's.